Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. The Jefferson Council is delighted to host this event in collaboration with the Young Americans for Freedom. As you all know, because I recognize an awful lot of you, the mission of the council is to uphold Thomas Jefferson's founding vision of following the truth wherever it shall lead. And following the truth requires entertaining a wide range of partisan and ideological viewpoints, which sadly are not always in evidence here at the University of Virginia. But we have a remedy for that. We bring speakers to UVA to provide those missing perspectives. And our speaker this evening, Mr. Wilfred Reilly, provides a corrective balance for just about every ideological controversy you can think of. In his book, Hate Crime Hoax, he documented scores of alleged hate crimes, most of them taking place on college campuses, that turned out to be spurious. In Taboo, he addressed topics related to sex, race, and economic inequality that people can't talk about, especially on college campuses, without being called a bigot. And in his most recent book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, could easily have been entitled Lies My College Professor Told Me. He debunks leftist narratives ranging from the peaceful Native American myth to the European colonialism created nothing but evil myth. Once upon a time, Americans looked to its most prestigious academic institutions to defend the legacy of Western civilization. Sadly, UVA can't even defend its own legacy. The history of UVA is told by many as a chronicle of racism and oppression from the time of Thomas Jefferson until the modern day. I think our speaker will have something to say about that. But first, let me introduce James Pilot, who will tell you a bit about our co-host, the Young Americans for Freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon. My name is James Pilot, and I'm an executive officer here at YAF here on grounds, and I'd like to provide a brief introduction to YAF's mission here at UVA. This is an organization that has stood at the forefront of conservative youth activism since its founding. YAF was established in 1960 when young conservatives gathered to draft a declaration of principles advocating for limited government, free enterprise, traditional values, and a staunch opposition to communism. Since its inception, YAF has championed conservative thought on college campuses, shaping the national dialogue. Here at UVA, our chapter will continue this mission of inspiring young Americans through conferences, internships, and its renowned speaker program, equipping the next generation to lead in the conservative movement. We will host conservative speakers here on grounds, engaging in political advocacy, and most importantly, protect and safeguard Thomas Jefferson's legacy at the University of Virginia. For over 60 years, YAF has shown that youth have the power to shape the future of our nation by standing boldly for what they believe in, and we continue on planning to do so. Again, YAF's mission has always been to foster thoughtful dialogue, bring important voices to the forefront of campus discussions. Tonight, we are privileged to continue that tradition by hosting a speaker who embodies the very principles we strive to uphold: intellectual diversity, courage in the face of adversity, and commitment to engaging with challenging ideas. With that said, YAF is extremely excited and honored to have Professor Wilfred Reilly here on grounds with us tonight, and a special thanks to the Jefferson Council for co-sponsoring this event with us tonight. Thank you for your time.
Hello. Oh, all right. How are you guys? Great. All right. I'm glad to be here. I am Will Reilly. I'm an associate professor of politics at Kentucky State, which is a historically black college located about an hour or so from Appalachia. An interesting location to be sure. And the author by now of 4 books, in addition to one rarely read academic monograph I've written Hate Crime Hoax, Taboo, a book on censorship, and the book that was most recently referred to, Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. As a capitalist, I will note that you should buy them. Now, it's good to be here. Thanks to all of you guys for being here. Special thanks to the students. I understand that this is your finals week or the week before your finals week. It's the same at K-State and Kentucky, so I understand that you're taking some time out of your schedule to come watch me talk here. And the topic of my speech today is sort of the underlying topic of a lot of my speeches, which is the disconnect between perception, especially the kind of narrative-driven perception that's almost mandatory in the American upper middle class, and reality. So the title that the Jefferson Council went with focuses a lot on hate crimes, but we're going to move beyond that. We're going to talk a little bit about UVA. We're going to talk about my latest book. We're going to talk about American race relations. The speech itself is only about 35 minutes, but I assume there's going to be at least that much time for questions from the audience. So first, I did write a book about hate crimes, or more specifically about hate hoaxes. This came out with Regnery, which is the nation's largest conservative press, back in 2019, 2020. And the narrative of a wave of hate crimes was part of the general kind of Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Jacob Blake, just getting into George Floyd's storyline in the country of extreme racial conflict. And we probably all remember some of the hate stories in particular. I mean, Jussie Smollett draped with a noose in downtown Chicago. In Streeterville, our young businessman's neighborhood where once I lay my own head. Covington Catholic, where a group of high school athletes surrounded and taunted an old Native American Indian man. They threatened to take his sacred rain drum away. This was in Washington, D.C. They chanted, "Build the wall," which is a damned ironic thing to say to an Indian. Yasmin Saweed, where a group of sexually aggressive white men surrounded a Muslim woman, a hijabi Muslim woman, and ripped her head covering away. The initial stories were quite horrible. I mean, the presentation was of a country close to the brink of racial or even class warfare. And there was a deeper storyline of politically driven hate here. At one point, the Washington Post claimed that hate had surged 200%, that was a quote, in counties in the country which had held Donald Trump rallies. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned that later in the speech, so that's just a statistical trick. Like, hate crimes increased 2% in counties that the Donald visited, which tended to be bigger, and 1% in other counties. And 2% is 200% of 1%. And statistical tricks like this are often played by the media, and in the more boring central portion of my speech, I'll talk through a few of them. But again, as noted, this is part of a broader theme. So part of this from sort of 2012 on was the idea that police officers and security forces were really almost murdering young black men in large numbers. So Cherno Biko from Black Lives Matter at one point appeared on primetime Fox News to say that an unarmed or at least innocent black man was murdered roughly every day. His figure was about 350 a year, if I recall it correctly. Super lawyer Ben Crump went even further the same time period. He wrote a book that you can still buy on Amazon. I think it's still a bestseller called Open Season, The Legal Genocide of Colored People. He claimed that the toll across a whole set of public policies was at least in the tens of thousands. And people apparently believe this sort of stuff, or at least did. So there's a think tank called the Skeptic Research Center, which polled fairly recently, and they found that at least among political liberals, 31% of respondents in a big, we'd call it a large N, pretty representative sample, thought that the average number of unarmed black men killed annually by police was about 1,000. That was the exact phrasing. Another 14 or 15% thought it was about 10,000. And another 8% thought it was more than that. And all of this went beyond the cops. So again, we were all supposed to be almost at war. Another idea of the period was the claim that normal citizens were constantly clashing and fighting along racial lines, with black Americans in particular being abused. So you had these storylines like Barbecue Becky, who is a woman who broke up a gathering in Oakland and became internationally famous, found herself memed into Black and indeed overall American history. And all of these other essentially random citizens who were assigned names and social profiles for participation in these basically street scuffles. But to some extent, then I and a bunch of other people, Heather McDonald comes to mind, Roland Fryer, started looking at this for universities or for consulting clients. My first book is called Hate Crime Hoax because there never actually was any epidemic of hate crimes. At this time, there were about 7,000 per year. That's out of 12 to 20 million total index crimes in a typical year. And many of those which were prominently reported turned out not to be real. So all the cases I mentioned so far obviously were hoaxes. And I don't really even want to make jokes about this, but obviously Jussie Smollett was not mugged in the coldest day of the year by people wearing MAGA hats and patriotic ski masks in downtown Chicago. He fought them off bravely while holding a Subway sandwich and so on. But this turned out to be true for a huge percentage of at least high-profile hate crimes overall. Air Force Academy, where a general initially went to the campus and warned students about their quote-unquote racial hostility toward each other. Kansas State, where someone had traveled through the campus spray painting horrific racial slurs on these high-end cars. The University of Missouri, where the initial claim was that someone had drawn swastikas and human feces on the wall of one of the men's dorms. The University of Chicago, so on down the line. As I recall, UVA had a very prominent case, which didn't make the book, but where someone accused the fraternities of running, no offense to UVA, I don't think that's a bad thing, sir, but where someone accused the major campus fraternities of running sort of anti-feminist rape gangs, and this led Rolling Stone for a month before being revealed to be, as I understand it, entirely false. Interestingly enough, this isn't in the speech, but a huge percentage of these hoaxes were concentrated on college campuses. So about 1% of Americans are currently enrolled college students, but that's where about 60% of the hoaxes took place. So there is a question of how much we're giving these young people with a lot of time on their hands the idea that victimization confers a sort of power. So at any rate, overall, I put together a set of 409 confirmed hate hoaxes that were concentrated in the 5 years before the book in order to sort of pitch it to Regnery. And that's quite a lot, considering that there are, again, only 7,000 even possible hoaxes per year, because that's the number of crimes, and only about 1/10 of those were widely reported enough to possibly be debunked. Obviously, I needed a media story or a second police report or some such proving that this didn't happen to include a case in the book. And the same thing turned out to be true more broadly. Almost unsurprisingly, there are almost no truly innocent, unarmed people shot by the police, simply on their way to church or a game of basketball. I had to do a bit of a deep dive to get these numbers when I first started writing. Again, the Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald had most of them a bit earlier. But in 2015, the total number of Americans killed by on-duty LEOs, law enforcement officers, was 1,000. Only about 250 of them were black, 249. This is 2015. And the total number of unarmed black people killed by white officers was 17. So today, the Washington Post, somewhat surprisingly, I keep expecting them to take this down, but just has a database that breaks this down. It's called The Counted. And last year's unarmed black number, at least for males, was 12. It's worth noting the number across all men was under 100 now for unarmed people. The cops have gotten a little better on this, but this is just never a major national problem. That's across Native Americans, poor whites, Irish, Italian, Hispanic Americans, so on down the line. So this was a frenzy that was ginned up out of essentially nothing. And that's something I keep returning to when writing. And that's something that goes back to Barry Glassner writing The Culture of Fear, about terror people feel about everything from big dogs to plane crashes to child kidnapping. Is that based in reality at all? As a citizen with a television in your house, it's a question that's always worth asking. And moving on, there's also not a ton of serious interracial crime. Going into and breaking down the standard Bureau of Justice Statistics data, it's called the BJS, I find that only about 3% of serious, again, index crime, it's 600,000 out of 20 million crimes, involves traditional it consists of traditional interracial crime, violent crimes where whites attack blacks or vice versa. It's also worth noting, being honest as a black guy, and because most of the commentary here comes from the left, that those few incidents slant more than 80% black on white. But the primary feature was how rare this was. I'm sure most of you heard this before. I say it in some of my after-dinner speeches, but the person most likely to kill you by far is your wife or your husband. And I'll do the full thing. A bit of a distinction, by the way, is that it's often your current husband and your ex-wife. So, as I've noted, I'm not sure whether that says something deep about the two sexes there. Men more brutal and warlike, acting in the moment. Women perhaps a few IQ points smarter and capable of a more abiding hatred. We'll move on, but the data is what it is. But anyhow, I got interested enough in this idea of this disconnect between sort of narrative and reality, between things almost everyone believes, that you're very likely to be attacked by kind of fighting men of another ethnic group, that the police are extremely violent to normal citizens, that for that matter, that your kids are at extreme risk if you let them out of your house. These very popular ideas versus what the actual numbers are, that it became the focus of my next book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which is sort of a response to an entire genre. So over the past 40 to 50 years, there have been at least 10 best-selling books that kind of focus on the idea that American education is run from the political right, and it keeps presenting the country as a better place than it is. And to this audience, that might sound almost like a joke. But you have, I mean, there are a dozen of these at least. You have A People's History of the United States, where a communist author basically says that he is providing a more honest retelling of the past from the perspective of poor and oppressed people, the history of immigration from the perspective of the Irish, of the Indian Wars from the perspective of the Indians. This is Howard Zinn. You have Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is supposed to be an Indian history of the USA. A cynical Republican suite mate of mine in college, who's actually a member of YAF, once summarized this whole book as "you lost" in a report. But I think that's a mean description. It's supposed to be the Indian take on the wars that formed this country. But you have the 1619 Project's book, 1619, which claims that everything unique about America grew out of African-American slavery. There's actually a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which I'm sort of responding to, and which is all of this stuff combined for almost 400 pages. And to break conservative taboo, some of this stuff may have been necessary when these authors started writing in the 1960s and 1970s and critiquing school curricula that were put together in maybe the 1950s. But they've been in charge for 50 years now. And their books are unironically the textbooks now. And so the question is, are these people any more honest than the people who came before them on the other side? And the short and simple answer is no. And so, I mean, to talk about some of the things in the next text, and I probably have time to go through all of these, although, like, as one of the faculty members from UVA said earlier, like, raise your hand if this gets boring, and I'll move through it. I mean, there are like 4 or 5, like, just chunks of American history here. But I mean, so for example, we often hear that slavery was America's original sin, and that this is Nicole Hannah-Jones, who I'm quoting here, chattel slavery in the United States was unlike slavery anywhere else on earth. But as it turns out, this simply and empirically is not true. Throughout history, the Romans, West Africans, Thais, and Ceylonese, most other powerful peoples all had swarms of slaves. The Aztecs used to eat theirs. The Arabic slave trade into East Africa lasted there was a shortage of other large meat animals in that region of Mexico. The Arabic slave trade, when I'm talking about cynical friends from graduate and law school, an ex-girlfriend of mine once described humans as the first large domesticated animal, which is probably the most staggeringly cynical thing I've ever heard anyone say, but which is 100% true when you think about it. So the Arabic slave trade into East Africa lasted far longer than the white equivalent and included something like 17 million people. The general figure given for the Atlantic slave trade is 12 million people. So there are a great many of these historical atrocities. I don't necessarily see a point in ranking them. But I then move on. There was a trade in white Barbary slaves as well, run entirely by Muslim and black masters, which sold at least 3 million people over the years. So the idea of enslaving captured fighters of whatever color was one of the most universal human practices. As it turns out, depressingly, one of the first human words was slave. So the ancient Sumerians, it's actually, to understand human nature, it's worth looking at the old hieroglyphic languages, by the way, where the term for money will be something like bag of money exchanged for a heart. Or the term for merit, sorry. But one of the first human words was slave. The ancient Sumerians, Akkad and Babylon and all of that, used to fight wars with the powerful tribes in the mountains to the northwest, across the Euphrates and the Zagros, if I have that correct. And one of their first 5 to 10 written symbols was the image for man or woman from the mountains overlaid with something like a shackle. So this meant exactly what it sounded like, captured enemy. Almost all of these people were chattel slaves, which just refers to someone who can be owned and sold, and whose children would likely be slaves as well. It's a depressing topic, but a very well-researched and recorded one. And throughout most of history, this was simply the punishment for defeat. The Roman Caesars were famous for sending opponents letters directly threatening slavery and saying things like, if you oppose me, your people will become property and your nation will become a memory. None of this is a defense for American black slavery or the wars of the past. I will, in fact, go out on a limb here and oppose slavery. But it does provide critical context. If the modern West did anything truly unique in terms of this ancient and bloody system, it would be ending it. There's another story, or this is another story, but I kept finding examples of this kind of thing, doing research for the book. Native Americans were not especially peaceful, although the texts now almost universally say they were. Do you guys want to hear this portion of the book as well? Oh, okay. Fair enough. I'm just asking, polling the audience. All right, so chapter 3 of my book, for example, is called Lie the Third, Native Americans Spent All Day in Dancing. And so again, this is an actual thing that humans with mouths say. I was able to obtain the official US government curriculum on Native Americans, and it reads like the speech about how every rock has a secret name from the Disney movie Pocahontas. One actual passage is quoted here: "There was a love of every form of life. The Native Americans did not kill anything they could not use. They never killed an animal or a fish for the sport of it. Native Americans lived in harmony with nature and did not abuse the natural world. They were ecologists long before the word was ever used." Another one argues that there was a fairly universal and wonderful Native American value system prior to 1492. Some components of it allegedly were, these are all quotes, respect for one's fellow man, no major wars, no poor and no rich, no jails, taxes, borders, or boundaries. This is a pretty typical take from what I've been able to figure out. History Central, the major website, although admittedly not an academic one, also contains a lot of original material, or educational material, about the first inhabitants of the USA. They say most Native Americans had no need to farm. Food and other resources all but fell from the sky. The land was full of animals. I'd actually have to check and see whether that part's a direct quote, but the land was full of animals, the sea was full of fish, wood was plentiful, and so on. Most people have heard some version of this take and basically believe it. Skeptic Research Center, again, recently found that about 70% of people believe that all of the Native American tribes lived in peace and harmony until the white man came. And there actually are movies about this sort of thing with names like The Conquest of Paradise. So for nearly as long a period as we presented Western civilization as, what was the term, the end of history, the culmination of what humans had done, we've now been critiquing it and saying that we are sort of a plague on the world and on the other peoples that lived here. But the entire "our people conquered paradise" narrative is just BS to a striking degree. It's a weird sort of reverse racism. My own opinion would be that no humans are better or worse than any others. We're all the same predatory apes with the same inclinations that we had 10,000 years ago, a thing that needs to be closely regulated, but which can be entertaining in day-to-day life. But on the real academia front, scholars writing for the journal American Antiquity actually just confirmed some of what I'm saying. The most violent time in American history, according to them, was before any whites got here. So they look at the Southwest around the time of the fall of one of the great native empires, the Anasazi, and they note that 90% of all male bodies showed signs of death by warfare, which is something that's actually very detectable. Head trauma, broken forearms as you attempt to fight, so on down the line. One area that they studied went from a population of 40,000, it was a fairly sizable city, to a population cited as 0 over 30 years. And that's pretty typical for what used to be called, quote unquote, savage men, by the way. Until the 1960s, about 60% of Yanomamo males, that's a free tribe that still exists in South America, died in violent duels or raids. What happened to women who were captured during this violence was usually no better. So life was pretty cold and short, nasty, brutish, and short is the famous formulation, of course, before Christianity or science or feminism or many of the other things that define the modern world. So I'm not going to go on all day about Native Americans, but obviously the great southwestern tribes were not alone. The Aztecs in modern Mexico have become a bit legendary, but it's actually worth going into why. Aztec society was structured to a bizarre extent around the worship of a bloodthirsty pantheon of war gods and the human sacrifice that went along with this. An Aztec prayer includes the line, "The gods love the tears of children." So the long-running, they were called the Flower Wars between the Aztecs and their neighbors, the Choluans, were fought largely to get captives who were sacrificed in numbers of up to 20,000 to dedicate temples and so on. They were also eaten. We all know this at some level, but it now appears the Aztecs ate so many people that it affected their health. So, per Bernard Ortiz de Montellano, pretty obviously not someone who hates Latinos or New World Indians, Aztec cannibalism satisfied up to 7% of all the need for protein inside at least the city of Tenochtitlan, which is the Aztec capital. It was probably the largest city in the world at that time. This is apparently considered a low-end figure, by the way. There actually, by the way, as someone who's been a leader, there's a real city planning problem here. I mean, they had about 300,000 people concentrated in this area that didn't have any food, so they had to come up with, let's say, innovative solutions. They also got very good at aquaculture, which is probably the path I would have encouraged them to go down. But, you know, yeah, they'll just go on with this. Things weren't that much nicer everywhere else. We could get into the Sioux and Comanche and Tonkawa and so on pretty easily. But all of this obviously contributed to warfare between the native peoples and the incoming Americans, many of whom, Scotsmen, Irishmen, the captured black West Africans who are my ancestors, weren't significantly less warlike. So we often hear that the USA broke every single treaty, quote unquote, with the great tribes, but the reality is that both sides almost invariably did. Almost everyone in history, and I think this is important to remember when people critique, for example, Jefferson, almost everyone until about 1955 was a savage by today's standards. The right of conquest wasn't abandoned until after World War II. Women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. Schools, whites and African Americans didn't go to school together, and this was to a large extent due to intense dislike on both sides until 1954. So, I mean, modern civilizational behavior is a norm that we've had for a couple of decades. And it's extremely bizarre to reach back over the great span of centuries and try to apply it to, for example, biblical figures or the founding fathers or leaders in Africa and Asia. It's an odd thing that we've recently started doing. This isn't in the speech, but it's worth noting. It's a unique pathology of contemporary Western society. I notice also that we only do this with our own society. I suppose it's plausible to critique, again, Thomas Jefferson as a bloodthirsty warlord by today's standards, But it's not plausible to critique Thomas Jefferson as a bloodthirsty warlord by today's standards and say that Shaka Zulu or Genghis Khan was a great leader. And this dichotomy and its illogic seems to have escaped a great many people. But anyway, the reality is that almost everyone until recently broke treaties. A raid across a border in force breaks a treaty and starts a war, as we just saw in the Middle East. And both groups, on average, the whites and the natives, did this about once a month from the research I've been able to do. Living next to Hamas, in fact, is probably a fairly close, fairly accurate analogy for living close to the Comanche Indians. So that's what I and a research associate and a lot of previous scholars actually found in the context of native North America, looking honestly and with open eyes. I don't dislike the Caucasian incomers or the Indians, but the facts seem fairly self-evident. And pretty much every other serious topic that I looked at for both of these books followed this same pattern of revelation, which I would define as the people claiming to be the marginalized resistance controlling the narrative and basically lying. And it could go on. White people and middle-class black people did not flee from long integrated cities like Detroit during the giant 1960s riots because they suddenly decided they hated each other for strange, prejudiced reasons that had nothing to do with the 500% increase in crime. That would be the white flight chapter. Perhaps most notably, we did not have a Red Scare in the 1950s, which I would define as an irrational panic, where national heroes like filmmaker Dalton Trumbo were falsely accused of being communists absent evidence. In fact, we were involved in an existential conflict with the communist USSR at this time, and there were a ton of communist spies in the USA. As a political scientist, I've actually read the set of documents that are called the Venona Cables. And you guys can honestly look through most of what's in them online. I mean, a fair number of the releases are on Wikipedia or Britannica. You can just Google Venona, V-E-N-O-N-A, cables. We broke the Russian codes decades ago, and we actually have a pretty full record of who the Russian spies were. And this isn't the story now that it would have been 30 years ago, but the short form is almost everyone who is accused of being a Ruski spy, Alger Hiss, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Dalton Trumbo, as I recall, I'd have to check the Venona cables again, actually was a Russian spy. Very few of them were, in fact, innocent. You can literally scroll down the list of probable Russian agents and find all of their names. And all of you can confirm this within about 30 seconds. So I won't say every, but many aspects of this. I actually thought about bringing a tinfoil hat to this speech, but I didn't want the image on the internet because it would be very easy to cut out and meme. But many aspects of the story that most, again, upper middle class citizens and institutions like this one have heard for the past, say, 50 years is untrue. But, and here's the thing that's genuinely unusual, you will be called insane if you say that. And this is not uncommon. So I have some closing notes. This is a bit more off the head than fully written down. First, you see this everywhere. I took an informal version of the campus's Jefferson tour. Some of you guys were kind enough to walk me around the campus. Did you guys know that Jefferson owned slaves? Okay. Did you know that the University of Virginia benefited from slave labor? Okay. I mean, I think it's fair to mention these things. These are unfortunate facts about history. I mean, I think when you consider Thomas Jefferson, it's also fair to mention that he was one of our consensus top 5 greatest presidents, negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. The University of Virginia has 9 Nobelists. I've known that for several years, actually, because they're a friendly rival of my own University of Illinois. Currently, I think 2 behind. Solid job. But I mean, won the Hoops National a few years back. So I think that the unfair use of context is an easy way to create dishonesty. Like, if you take an institution that's currently 15 or whatever the case might be in terms of national performance, and your entire focus when introducing it to potential students is racial conflict in its history, that objectively would strike me and probably most other normal citizens as insane. However, that's something that you see very, very frequently around the country today. Ask yourself, is that an honest, logical way to do things? There's probably an answer there, although it might vary with each individual person. Why is this happening? Again, just some scrawled out thoughts. I think one reason is the insane level of partisan and social class bubbling in the United States. This isn't something I've personally researched. I don't have a book on it. But I mean, I've looked at the data on the political inclinations of college professors pretty recently for a National Review piece, not a text. As of right now, 18% of university professors identify as communists. You can find this on the website. It's not university professors. It's university professors in the social sciences. So only like half of them, maybe a third. And you can find this again on the website EconLib, EconLib. All this stuff's pretty easily checkable. 18% of social science professors identify as Marxist or communists. An additional 21%, these are three separate questions, identify as political radicals. An additional 24% identify as, I think the language used was strong activists. So you've got about 60% of people within this group that have very atypical attitudes. I mean, so I'm not even that's the way I voted in the last election, but I'm not a registered Republican. I'm about maybe 55th, 60th percentile to the right, which is pretty standard for males in the USA. I think I would be considered a raving lunatic in most faculty lounges. So you've got this You've got extreme concentration on one side of the spectrum when it comes to what you could call discourse, I guess. You've got the same thing in the media. I mean, Pew Research looked at this in 2004. One of the faculty members in the room might correct me by a year or two. They redid this in 2011. But last I recall, 7% of national media journalists identified as conservatives or libertarians. So the other 93% would again be Marxists, leftists, or left-leaning moderates. And when you have that bubble, and that combines with the class bubble, I mean, so almost every one of these jobs is one from about 40 institutions, including yours, mine, the entire Ivy League, the Patriots and military academies. I mean, you could name all of the schools that are producing the people in these positions. So you have a very atypical block of people that are making all these decisions, and further, they're all on this side of the atypical spectrum politically. And I think that's how you get these crazy decisions. As someone who's a businessman and investor from time to time, as well as an academic, I mean, I think this is how you get stuff. I'll ask, did you guys see that the Bud Light image girl for this past year was Dylan Mulvaney, who's a trans woman, I guess would be the polite term? Okay, I didn't, it was more a youth thing. I think that's how you get a decision like that, where there's someone who's biologically male lounging sensually in a bathtub drinking from a Bud Light. I don't think that decision was made by Bud Light's base of fraternity men. Similar to Jaguar, anyway. I think that's how you get these calls made. Yeah, so, and I guess the question is what to do about it. You seem personally offended by that last one. So what to do about it? I mean, check real sources. Almost everyone in this room could pretty easily pull up Skeptic Research Center, EconLib. I mean, several of you are university professors. I recognize some of you from the sort of business and social community here. Some of you, I think, follow me on Twitter. Badly advised enough to do that. So just look up the source that the paper got their nonsense from. I think my final tip, though, I have like 3 or 4 here, but I'll only give 2. Look up original data. And second, don't panic. When you hear this nonsense like a race war is on the horizon, this is my least favorite thing about social media, where members of all ethnic groups, blacks, whites, will post videos of like their side losing a fight and say something ridiculously apocalyptic like Cleveland has fallen. I would avoid doing this. It's just nonsense. That's just that team losing after a Friday night football game. Crime is actually, if anything, down right now, although those numbers are a little questionable. But I think that the broader don't panic point would be something like we're on our 20th failed apocalypse right now. I mean, this is actually an idea I have for a potential future book, but just looking through all of these, like some of you may remember peak oil 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You know, the population bomb back in the 70s and 80s when we were all going to die and the entire nation of India was going to implode. Global cooling, which dominated the media for at least a half year, a year before global warming had a decade. What else was there? I mean, there were a ton of them. The Club of Rome, we were going to run out of all resources. Killer bees and the Great Northerly Migration. The air was going to become unbreathable. The rain was going to turn to fire. I think in almost every situation, humans either developed an alternative technology for example, chlorofluorocarbons, or the problem just never materialized because people were making investment in more dangerously life bets based on an unlikely worst-case scenario they were being terrified about by television news readers with really nice hairdos. And I would advise you guys not to do that. Fear not too much. Act like citizens again. Thank you. Now I'm available for questions and such. Appreciate it. All right, sir. I don't know if you guys have a mic. Yeah, thank you, sir. Bring the mic around, I guess, to people who have questions. If you strongly disagree with me, go to the front of the line.
Thanks so much for speaking today, and
course.
thanks to the Jefferson Council for hosting you. I do follow you on X. Y2K, you left that one out. That was a big
Oh, yeah, thank
mass
you.
hysteria. But well, I have two questions I'd love to ask you, but I don't want to hog them, so you pick which one you want. One of them is the fear that something's going to happen, that society's collapsing. Like you said, Cleveland has fallen. But, you know, Douglas Murray, who I'm sure you're an admirer of as well as I am, wrote a book called The Strange Death of Europe. And it wasn't the death of the West, and it was talking about, obviously, immigration, all these sorts of problems that have become thematic in American politics and obviously led to this popular victory for Trump and Republicans. Is it really hysteria, or do we really have something to learn from what happened in Europe and to be concerned about that happening here in America? Because we see a lot of the same trends, but we don't have the same numbers of hostile immigrants. There's a lot of economic immigrants, but not necessarily hostile to our way of life.
Yeah, so I think that obviously I don't believe the world, everyone can still hear me, right? Okay, good. I don't believe that the world is going to end, and I was kind of making fun of the outlier limits of climate change hysteria there. I mean, from the best Norwegian research I've read, the current climate change prediction is that the world will be 2 degrees warmer at the end of 125 years. Now, again, someone in the room, I'm sure that might be off by a degree, or it might be Celsius degrees or something like that, but I don't think that's going to kill us all. Like, I tend to believe we're not just going to stare at the very slowly rising water until we all drown. Like, if you look on Robinhood or E-Trade or a similar just standard investment marketplace like Seawall companies, their stock prices are moving up slightly. And that's what you'd actually expect to see in kind of a common sense world. So in terms of like, but in the world that's not going to end, there obviously can be power shifts. Like Western society could be supplanted for 100 years by Islamic society, which actually happened for 1,000 years during the Dark Ages, which were not dark in the, what is it, Sepharad, the highly civilized Spain and North Africa. As a Westerner, I'd prefer that not happen. So how would you avoid that? I mean, you just make the amoral decision not to let a bunch of people who hate you move into your country. Like, I mean, I think that there's something to be said for rational aggression. So yes, like whether ultimate morals exist or not is a fascinating question. I think that very few people are silly enough to feel compelled to behave ethically toward enemies, especially ethically toward enemies under what's called in political science a situation of anarchy, where you have countries that are trying to pursue their own rational interests and where there's no expectation of reciprocity, if that makes sense. So if a bunch of people from a powerful Muslim country like Turkey come into your country, there's no expectation that a bunch of your poor people can move into that powerful Muslim country. There's no expectation of anything. So while I love the Turkish people I know and I enjoy their great cuisine and so on, I would stop them all at the border and send them back. And actually, this wouldn't be very difficult. I mean, like, we've kind of handicapped ourselves by saying that virtually everything is impossible. If you sunk one boat full of adult fighting men, the influx would stop. I'm not even necessarily recommending that, but just tie 3 of them together, tow them back. You know, like, it wouldn't be very difficult to say, no, we're not doing this anymore. And I think the reason for Murray's title is that Europe seems incapable of doing this. I don't think that we're incapable of doing that in the USA. A final comment. I also think immigration here is something a bit different. Immigration to the United States is mostly Latinos from second world but highly stable countries like Mexico. Now, that's still annoying. We've traditionally had sort of a little brother relationship with that nation, no offense to its great population. But there's no existential threat to a bunch of master carpenters from Juarez coming to the United States. There's no hate of the Christian religion or anything among that population. So traditionally what we've done with Mexico is every so often, anyone who's committed a crime or just sort of annoyed the US population gets sent back en masse, and I think that's what Trump is very likely to do. But I don't think the same existential threat faces us.
Thank you. I had a second question, real quick one maybe.
Sure.
Since we're at a university, this
At
is
least
a big
hear
issue here. Is the humanities is just I think it's a lot more professors that are lean Marxist. They don't call themselves Marxist, and that's a big problem here. Do you think this is something that the ship can be righted? This university is certainly not even as bad, obviously, as a Columbia or something like that. And do you think that at some point universities might do well and students might do well to just pick STEM-only universities and just avoid the humanities altogether? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to say something that's taboo in my profession, but I think a lot fewer people should probably go to college. I mean, when you look at the fields that are really lacking in terms of potential enrollees, it's things like the U.S. Marines, the priesthood, the Peace Corps, the Job Corps. I mean, all these situations where you can go in, make a pretty good living, learn a skill. I mean, in Chicago, I mean, the electricians union right now, I'm sure buddies from there will, again, critique this, but I think there are 14,000 slots open right now. So a lot of people that are getting degrees in the feminist queerness of Norway or something like that would probably be better served to pick up a community college associate's in hospitality management. Like if you want to go into a woman-led business that would be successful. So I don't necessarily think a lot of those fields are, you don't want to criticize the humanities, but the question would be first, well, I don't see why you wouldn't actually, but the question would be first, is there a value to, say, critiquing rather than producing literature? And if you argue that there is, and I've actually heard that argued fairly persuasively by feminist friends and so on, how many people do you need to do that? That's the second question. Very briefly, the government probably has a role to play here. Or the banks. There's a power broker here that's giving you $200,000 to go study this. That person can be influenced to make less people do it. Right now, one of the problems in the United States is the same problem I see when I've spent time in the LDC world. You have too many disaffected lower elites that don't have job roles they can fill. We see this in Appalachia as well. We see this almost everywhere, I'm sure. But if you graduate from, say, if you had a hard-scrabble childhood, you went to the University of Virginia or the University of Kentucky or one of the lower Ivies or something like that, but you got a degree in English Lit, Focus, Feminist Theory, and you get out and all your job offers are proposing a salary of $27,000. And so you stay on as a shift manager at Starbucks, which pays $41,000 a year. The idea that and you owe, say, $190,000 in debt. The idea that you're going to be very angry with the system or something like that is 100%. So the question is, how do you stop people from taking that path? And I would look at what the government can do, what the big banks can do, something like that, because that's a systemic problem. Most of those people don't need those degrees.
I'm curious about your student body, how they react to you when you present these ideas that challenge the narrative.
That's a great question. Now, there are two parts to this. One, interestingly enough, a historically black college in Appalachia is not that woke. I can think of two students who would be irritated to hear me say that, but in general, most of the people there are there to go on to law school, to become detective-level police officers, doctors, nurses. I mean, there's less of the, I'm going to go to college because everyone in my family has gone to college, and I'm going to become a college professor. So, and I think that's exacerbated by the fact that most of our executive team is black. I was our university ombudsman for a while. So if it's a room full of black guys, with the only outliers being Appalachian women, there's not much of an excuse. There's no one you can't blame the man. If we owe Kentucky $50 million, we do, and we have to pay it. So I think that really, that shuts a lot of that down right now. Our student leadership is in those rooms, and a lot of people are just there for solid, the traditional middle-class reasons you go to college. The one thing I will say that I've encountered is not anger, how dare you challenge Marx or something. It's the question of, why have I never heard these ideas? It was, I think, the Gorgias from Plato. This wasn't really my job, but I presented the argument for real beauty and absolute morality. Now, you may suspect that the second part of this is not something I necessarily believe as strongly in as I do everything else I might say, but I presented this to my students because I think it's something you need to know as a person, as a Westerner. And one thing that struck me was that none of them had ever heard it before. So it wasn't that they'd heard various relativist theories as a critique of this thing, which most people probably take as a given. It was that they'd only heard the critical theories, and they'd never heard the thing from the Bible, Plato, Socrates, or Tom Sowell or Milton Friedman, for that matter, that's supposed to be being critiqued. And that was one of the deeper things I had noticed as an academic. So that question led to that. So thank you. But that's I think a big problem that a lot of educators would notice. All right, it's a couple hands, sir.
Do you have a theory or a thesis on how woke institutions might be reformed, have the pendulum swing back to the center, have greater representation, broader representation of intellectual philosophies on faculty? Do you think that hope in this country that's going to happen with these institutions?
I think that what's going to happen is reasonably elite challengers first. I mean, I recently gave a talk at the University of Austin, and their whole model is that they want to attract Ivy quality students. I don't know if they're pretty close. I mean, like their SAT would be about on par with Michigan's or UVA's. I mean, there's certainly Ivies around that level. I mean, but they had about 4,000 student applicants, and they accepted, I think, 110 because they wanted to set that bar pretty high, and each year they want to double that. So in about 10 years, I think if you have a school that's producing all these people that are going on into very specific law and medical schools, doing very specific things that they want to do, and more people are looking at that as an alternative, like I don't have to take a course in some kind of DEI nonsense to graduate. I don't have to sign a diversity statement to graduate. But even beyond that, like I don't have to write a lengthy 4-page essay about my personal politics or the worst experience of my entire life to get in. I just have to turn in a test score. I think that that's going to be so appealing that you're going to see mainstream universities swing back. And there are multiple other institutions, New College and so on, that are doing that. It's really, I will say one thing, I actually think from almost a business perspective, it's not that difficult to do that. One thing that people don't know about the academic job market is because of the lower elite crisis, there's so many of them, most PhDs don't get hired anywhere. And the focus in hiring right now is really very much on kind of diversity or being very innovative. Like the first person ever to argue that Shakespeare really was, and if you're just someone who's very good at math, it's probably going to be a 5 or 6 year hunt across adjunct jobs and so on. So there's plenty of room for someone to come in and say, frankly, we're going to start up a college. We're going to hire all these people that are on their 7th adjunct job, and then we're going to go looking for students. So I think that would help. There's also a role for politics. I mean, most large flagship universities have a major relationship with the state. I mean, is there anything you probably can't just fire tenured faculty members, although I'm sure there are cheats and workarounds that, governors can and should exploit. But, all that stuff, can you require people to state their political beliefs as any part of a condition for employment, something like that? I mean, you'd probably take that out tomorrow. So that would be the second point. I'd like to see people start doing that. I'd like to see competitors arise. Other than that, I mean, it's going to be a fairly long pendulum swing because this was allowed to happen. I mean, intellectuals, I'd also, by the way, one thing you do as a smart citizen is just take intellectual work in other areas, like the giant center-right think tank, seriously. Like, it's pretty obvious that, like, something that for that matter, but Tom Sowell, I mean, 100 Eric Kaufman, 100 other people say, Chris Rufo, outside of the hallowed halls is often pretty on point. So, I mean, there are many sources of knowledge while this fight is going on. A lot of people are simply choosing not to go the academic route. All right, I think this guy back here has been waiting for a while.
Yeah, and this, you were just talking about the topic I wanted to ask about, which is, have you ever done a diversity statement yourself, and how would you advise applying for a faculty position? Would you just say, University of Austin is your only option, or what would you put for that?
I'll be blunt about this with the camera running. I would probably just lie. I would view myself in an amoral competitive market, and I would just put down the things that I would view my potential employer as wanting. I mean, like, there's this again, if you're a religious man, talk to your priest. But I think that the basic idea of, do you owe the Caesar figure more than the technical tax limit? I am not one to say yes. If someone's asking you for something that they probably shouldn't ethically be asking you for, that you think is a joke, I would just respond by saying, though there are two levels here, this is the ethical level, but in that situation, I would respond by saying, well, this is the drivel you want me to give. There's also an amoral level of analysis. If I do this, I'll get the job, and if I don't, I won't. So I would just say whatever the requested nonsense is, and then go in and after tenure in 3 years, say whatever you want. That is, by the way, like if I were a white or Asian male applying to Harvard, I would probably just say I was Hispanic or Native American Indian. I would have zero respect for the system. And I mean, like, I am in fact part Plains Indian. So here you go. And if you want to prove that people are lying and they should respect our serious policy, like, you can DNA test me and we can take it to court. That's my answer.
I wonder what your opinion is on possibly universal service to the United States, say for a couple of years after high school, with training and whatever fields might be of interest, should be reasonably well paid. There would be some sort of basic training of some sort, but a commitment to the country that would be required. I lived in Switzerland for a year where they have universal military service. I'm a physician. The doctors all went back 2 weeks every summer for some more basic training, marching, doing whatever they do. And I didn't hear any complaints about it. And the other thing was, Switzerland, I don't think it's had a real war since about 1400. There must be something to having a gun and being prepared, and if you're a reliable and responsible person. But just what about the idea of service to the country? Not necessarily military, but something greater.
I'm a strong supporter of that, actually. I think that if you are a sane society, and again, a lot of these questions get into a deeper idea of what is morality, what is honor, what duties do you owe to your society. But overlying that is just the practical reality that some things work and some things don't. And while we work out the underlying deeper set of questions, we should, absent a few consensus evil things, we should do the things that work and not do the things that don't. So what brings societies together? I mean, a shared sense of commitment, purpose, a shared set of experiences, so on. We now seem to be working exactly away from that. The idea of critical race theory is that everyone has different experiences that no one can understand if they're outside that group. As a male, I can never understand what my female partner goes through. Can we even be in love, some feminist writers would ask. As a black guy, I can never understand what a poor white guy goes through, or an immigrant from another country, all this sort of nonsense. And we're also getting rid of the bonding experiences, like varsity athletic participation's way down, military service is way down, even going to public schools way down as rates of crime increase and that kind of thing. So something like that, like everyone has to join the Army for 2 years, yeah, I totally support it. Now, I mean, I think that most of them probably wouldn't even be sent into full-on combat units. The guys in those units would strongly oppose that. Like, we don't want 200 boots coming into the, I mean, but there'd be plenty of useful work, cutting down trees, digging lakes. Like, you'd be a part of this group that would build consensus, support the country. Yeah, I support that. If you're a pacifist because you might have to fight, you could do something else. Civilian Conservation Corps we used to have, American Medical Corps. Yeah, I totally back that. I don't think there's a logical objection to doing that at all. The only objection, basically, is America's a bad country. Like, no one can make me fight for this country if I don't want to. I mean, this is the stuff that started in the 60s and 70s. I don't really support this country. I don't feel this country has a right to take anything from me. And a lot of this ties into stuff we're talking about, like, as a black man. I think that's nonsense. Yeah, we should make people do stuff like that. There should be some reward. Like you said, you should get paid, free college, community college. But yes, we should do it. Ma'am, and then you. I think you've had your hand up for a bit.
Hi there. I just want to say thank you so much for coming, and I really admire you, and I enjoy your talks and your books and whatnot. That said, I'm going to have to disagree with you on the issue of diversity statements. And I'm saying this only because I want to speak to your question. And diversity statements are essentially unconstitutional. So one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in with academia is because we've sat back and we've allowed them to do what they're doing in institutions like Harvard and Columbia, Yale, whatever. And to say that I would just go in and they just write what they want me to say is having children. I have one son that went to University of Michigan, one son that went to UVA, and another son that is currently here. They are constantly saying to me, Mom, I just filled it in to get an A. And I actually had one son at University of Michigan who wrote something that the teacher gave him a D for and told him that if he went back and rewrote it, he'd get an A, and he did it. He did what you just suggested. And for me as a mother, I was appalled.
Okay.
So what I'm just saying is that Since it's unconstitutional and they're asking for diversity statements, I would say if I were advising a young professional trying to find a job, don't fill it out. If we have enough people that do that and we start standing up for these people, then that's the only way to make true change. So that's the only thing that I just wanted to say.
It's completely honorable, citizen, that you disagree with me. So I think this is one of the great ethical questions, really. I mean, the whole idea of the whole do you give to Caesar thing is based on the idea that certainly all Jewish fighting males at this time, but most people in that community would view Caesar as an illegitimate king. So do you pay your taxes and continue on with your life, or do you essentially revolt? Those are the options. The Romans were known for their vigorous foreign policy responses. So I think that people would go 50-50, but there's a lot to be said for living. So I mean, in reality, and I'm not making fun of this at all, like in reality, if you do not fill out a diversity statement when you apply for any of these schools we're talking about, UK, UVA, I don't know if we have one at K-State right now. I mean, we're mostly black college, so we're actually looking for more Caucasians in many fields. But it seems funny, but as a black boss, you can't legally discriminate either. But in most schools in the top, say, 100, you're going to be asked to fill one out, and that's where 50% of the faculty jobs are. I don't really think, unless you are very comfortable with a small liberal arts school under that, that it strategically makes sense simply to send back those forms saying, I will not do this, I view it as immoral. Because the result would be that you would never be hired by any of those schools and you would wind up teaching at a Catholic prep school. So if you want to get into those schools and infiltrate, the only way to do that would be to do the thing that you view as somewhat amoral. This is actually a great question that this sort of thing came up in the discussions in some of the classes I've talked to today. Like, there are obviously rules that have hard lines, like don't eat people. There are other rules that are just made up in your own mind. Gentlemen prefer brunettes. But in between them, there are things like, when would you lie? Most people will lie to gain sufficient advantage for themselves, their family, and others close to them, and to protect others. And in situations like this in the workplace, that's basically what I'd advise people to do. I wouldn't advise someone to not get jobs in their preferred field. You know, in fact, like, because again, my perspective on this coming from the business world is, let's politely say pragmatic. I think you could simply fill out your nonsense diversity statement, send it in, and then if you talk to the holy man or whatever, feel a little guilty, you could then write a $5,000 check to a group that opposes the writing of diversity statements. I mean, like, there are 100 different ways to respond to this. So you can obviously lobby against something that you do. I would love to see the government not charge me taxes at all. And in fact, I've given money to local libertarian parties specifically to pursue this cause, which has some chance of success in Kentucky. But, in the meantime, I pay them because I don't want to see the trooper outside my house. So I do think that is that balance, but a good point and an ethical one. Sir.
Will, I think the exit poll suggested that 26% of black males voted for Donald Trump, which is
Get that up there. Those are rookie numbers.
blew away a lot of people's expectations. As a black male who teaches in a predominantly black university, do you have some insight into what's going on?
Yeah, I think one reason black men voted for Trump is that Trump presented himself to black men in a normal fashion. He seemed like a cool guy who'd been a businessman, been an athlete in his day, didn't seem to hate black men. So humans are a predator species. This is not going to be, again, the 9th discussion of ethics. But I think that people in general react with contempt to people who kowtow and behave in a strange, prey-like fashion. And I think that's generally the approach of the left to minorities. Like, we are so sorry that we exist, Like, when I've actually been in integrated locker rooms, people will just sort of tease each other. I mean, African Americans will often note to white guys that they are perhaps better athletes on average, that we are increasing as a chunk of the national population. White guys might note that they invented everything in the locker room. People will throw towels at each other. I mean, Hispanic individuals might critique all of the Americans for speaking only one language and that badly. I mean, so all of this is perfectly healthy, short of actual racism. I think that's the important point. And Trump's outreach to black men, at one point he asked, what the hell do you have to lose? But then he proposed, and I think it was called the Platinum Plan, which is very much a Donald Trump. He is a gauche figure. But I mean, he actually proposed outreach to black males in business communities. So on the one hand, he's teasing, he's talking trash, but on the other hand, he actually has a policy proposal. So I think he just approached black men like he'd approach any other subset of voters, and black men said, well, why not? Let's give him a try. I think that as opposed to the blatant pandering that you see so often, like kneeling wearing kente cloth and a George Floyd medallion, I mean, these are real things that have happened. The governor of Minnesota crying in front of George Floyd's coffin, which was made of gold and pulled by 4 horses down the Central Avenue in Minneapolis. Like these are things that would outrage many people, including me. So I mean, like, I think that contrasting that as a black guy who owns a dry cleaning service with Trump, a lot of people would just vote Trump. By the way, the Trump coalition, it wasn't just black men that swung toward Trump. I mean, Trump won 54% of Hispanic men. He won 46% of Hispanic women. He won 65% of Native Americans, male and female. You know, so it's getting increasingly hard to won a majority of Orthodox Jews. So it's getting increasingly hard to say, well, Donald Trump is supported by Nazis. Like if the guy standing behind him is a rabbi, which actually happened in Israel, there's just an element of like, no, you're not getting away with this anymore. It's an Indian chief. I mean, it's just, banter aside, I think it's becoming very obvious that Trump has a fairly diverse coalition. And I think that's good. Interestingly, the one group that remained solid for Kamala Harris was black women. And I think that's a more interesting question. So you see Hispanic men trending, white women trending. By the way, white women, for whatever reason, have taken a remarkable amount of abuse in recent years. The whole Karen thing, like, so it seems to be the one group where everyone's tossing darts from both sides. So the idea, there's actually a petition to repeal the 19th Amendment that circulated on social media for a while that now has several million signatures, as I recall. And the reason for that is the assumption that women, especially white women, tend to vote in a very left-wing empathic direction. But on the other hand, members of minority communities often accuse this particular population of being the kind of the swing vote, the group of people that decides for Trump. At least the first of these allegations doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, white women, I believe, voted 53% for Donald Trump. So, I mean, the black women were sort of the outlier. It was, I believe, 92-7, some slight variations on the percentage points there. And I think the question is why that is, because that's so bizarre. So atypical, it might be a better way to say that. Ma'am, what's going on? Oh, sorry, actually, sir, what's your question?
Just real quick, going back to the humanities discussion we had earlier, I'm wondering, and I'm projecting facts on the Kentucky State that may not be true, so correct me, but I'm assuming that at a state-supported, predominantly, well, historically black university, smaller than UVA, probably less influential, powerful, and certainly doesn't have the $1 billion endowment that we have here, that the marketplace would have to speak more to curricula choices there with the smaller budget and whatever. Is that having an impact on, less students are interested in taking these humanities courses because they're there to do the things you mentioned, which is to a better life, a vehicle to skills in graduate school, don't have time for the post-feminist whatever. Is it had an impact on what's available in the curriculum?
Yeah, HBCUs actually have surprising amounts of money. You have very active alumni bases as well as government giving, but you're still talking about hundreds of millions of dollars generally in endowments as opposed to, you guys would be at several billion, I'm assuming? 15 billion. That's Illinois, I think 9, so okay. Advantage UVA. Yeah, so you'd be talking about, but even then, like, we probably have enough money to waste building a center for this or that. But no, I mean, I think because so much of our funding and our interaction comes from the alumni, and it comes from the current alumni because we go through money pretty quickly. Yeah, I think you're right, actually. That would be the answer. There is less marketplace demand for that stuff. I would take a look at our curriculum, but I tend to suspect that's correct. Like our largest major is psychology, followed by criminal justice, pre-law, political science, pre-law, like all that sort of stuff. Nursing, maybe, nursing, pre-med combined. I mean, it's pretty standard stuff. Like it's all like go out and get a job kind of stuff. And I think that's, except for maybe Morehouse, that's what you'd see across most HBCUs, including ones that are pretty well ranked. So this is actually something that I think is interesting about colleges. UVA might be on the cusp of this. It's a public Ivy institution. But when I look at colleges, when I watch Fox News or MSNBC and I see them talking about the campus, it's always one of like 10 bespoke colleges that very few people go to. Like, we're seeing another riot here at Oberlin. You know, on the Bowdoin campus, there's been violence. It's never like Wisconsin on a football Saturday. So I tend to think that when you talk about the HBCUs, certainly, but all the A&Ms, the military schools, all the community colleges and all that kind of thing, but also like the Big Ten schools, the SEC schools. I mean, the majority of people in college is kind of going to college. Like, Illinois' largest major is engineering. So there are probably selected institutions that are really well known for a lot of kind of esoteric stuff, like Duke for a long time was known for its English department. I don't know, I'm really not familiar major by major with UVA, but I've never associated UVA with kind of the most esoteric work in the humanities, more with the sciences of anything. So yeah, it probably depends on the school. Like, the bigger the endowment and the more esoteric the student body, yeah, probably the more of that stuff you have. And there are also colleges that are designed especially for that. Like in Chicago, we have, what is it, Fashion School, the Art Institute or something. We have about 3,000 kids that are just there to study fashion and art. So, I mean, you know, if you pull up to the college and you see like the statue of Hecate outside, you probably, you know what this is, as they say in Chicago. So, ma'am.
Thank you. This is so interesting. And I was going to piggyback on Stan's humanities curriculum question.
Okay.
Stan's history of the people's history of America, apparently that's the widest read
Yes.
history, and it's so Marxist and so anti-America across every state. What do you do about that? Why can't the primary sources and the canon of American letters and all of this be brought back in so the children know how to, or students know how to think and then express themselves well? It's hard to find graduates that write well.
Yeah, so first of all, that's a great question. I think you illustrated a real problem with the American system, which is that the internal members of our society that dislike our society, the quote-unquote resistance, are usually the dominant voice within whole institutions. So there's actually, at the start of my book, I talk about this whole kind of three-card Monte that's being played, where people will say sort of, everything you've been told about society is a lie. This is like the pitch of Howard's End. Like, society is controlled by people, by like white people from the middle class on the far right, and they've been telling you how great society is, and now I'm here to tell you the truth. But the thing is, like, Caucasian burghers on the far right control almost no discursive institutions. And as tech has skyrocketed past, you know, steel and agriculture and so on in the business sector, they control very little of society overall. So in fact, I mean, just, I'm kind of blah, blah, blahing here, but yeah, like the high school textbooks actually are written from a communist perspective usually. I mean, like A People's History of the United States is probably #1. Lies My Teacher Told Me is in the top 10. So the books I'm critiquing are the textbooks. And they're also just empirically wrong. I mean, like, there's actually a book called Debunking Howard Zinn that's written by a conservative social scientist, and just 400 pages of all these errors. And a lot of the errors in this kind of stuff are pretty staggering. So, like, there's a book called King Leopold's Ghost that I'm currently writing a negative review of, but it's the argument that the crazy Belgian king killed 10 million people in the Congo. But if you actually go back into the same documents, he seems to have exaggerated by a scale of maybe 1,000. Bruce Gilley, the political scientist, pointed this out a while ago, that he seems to just be looking at like measures of population change without proving that anyone was killed during years when they had diseases and famines and other things going on. And this sort of stuff is actually extremely common. Like, the fairly explicit goal is saying, well, we're the most evil people in history. And this is the evidence that we need to kind of make up to prove that. So I guess your question is, like, what do we do about this book that says Americans and Europeans are the worst people ever? Because that's bad. I think that, first of all, again, there's a huge audience for anything else. So I was one of the people that founded the 1776 Project, with Bob Woodson and a bunch of other people, Coleman Hughes, which was kind of at least from the center on right, but like the black business and social scientific community's response to the 1619 Project. Because so much of the stuff the 1619 Project said was just crazy. I mean, the idea that everything in American history, which would include Irish pubs and Indian immigration, came directly from black slavery was clearly false. And I think at a certain level, intelligent people who were looking at that knew that it was false, and it was kind of making us look stupid. So we responded to that and drew up a curriculum for the schools that talked about black history from sort of a normal perspective. We also talked about ethnic white immigration, which at this point was being almost totally neglected. You can go to 1776unites.com and look it up if you're interested. But we put it on the website, and every month the curriculum's downloaded, I'd say 10,000 times maybe. It's used a lot in homeschools. It's used a lot by prep schools. It's used in a lot of mostly rural or ex-urban school districts. And we never charged for it. We didn't want to, but it's just, some members of the group may have had second thoughts about that. Look at these numbers. But like, you realize that there's this huge population of people that recognize that this is just crazy and want to change it. I mean, to some extent, actually, I'll give a very simple two-sentence answer. You have to have people who are intelligent on the center and right start manufacturing work product that's good. I mean, there's a last thing, because I'm a long talker, but there's a famous interview where the old Bob Murdoch, the guy who started Fox News, was asked, where'd you get the idea for this company? Like, what'd you think your client base was going to be? And he said 53% of the country. Like, I looked over at the news, and it was CNN. They didn't have MSNBC at the time, but NBC or the New York Times, the Washington Post. Everyone else was completely underserved. So I just recruited some good journalists that I knew leaned right, like Britt Hume, and I made a center-right television network. And now it's #1. I mean, so it's the same thing here. Like, someone just has to write. I mean, I did write one, actually, and now we're starting to see it picked up. But more people have to start writing things from the right, have to start producing. The Daily Wire's doing this pretty well, I think, where, like, What is a Woman really changed the trans debate. You know, shout to the Englishmen and the feminists and so on before this, but, like, the movie was a major motion picture. And you realize, looking at these academics, that they literally can't define a man and a woman. And anyone to go on a date or to a varsity tryout can. So people started looking at this and just saying, these people are idiots. And that really shifted things. And now you're seeing these bills go through Congress saying, well, none of this, at least for kids. So you need to, if you're on the right, or even just you're a normal centrist with a tie on, you need to kind of produce this stuff, support this stuff. That, I think, is really the answer there. And there are millions of people that will go out and buy it. Sir.
The CEO of Walmart announced last week that he's destructuring his DEI division. He's going to welcome people that want to work, and he's going to welcome people that want to spend money disregarding the percentages. Am I wrong to be encouraged that might be the pendulum swinging?
Nope. Walmart is the largest employer and largest purchaser in the USA. So, I mean, this isn't exactly a revelation, so I've said it on Twitter, but like I and a couple friends, Brooks Crenshaw, the former SEAL Teams guy, and Kevin Jackson, the former Fox executive, and 3 men of different ethnicities, but are actually planning on launching sort of an anti-DEI consulting brand. I mean, so where you'd go into businesses and step one would be you look through the praxis, you look through hiring manuals, all that, you take out certain language. Step 2 would be you'd bring in people like James Lindsay to explain what you've been listening to for the past 4 years. And step 3 would be you'd go into, say, a military or construction or something else modality and give people another way to build teams. And I mean, I think if Walmart wants to do that, it's a good sign. As you probably know, that's the reverse of how DEI spread in the first place. So the way affirmative action and all that works, for those in the audience who don't have a business world background, it kind of spreads out from the center. So the president can issue an executive order saying, the United States government does not do business with suppliers that do not practice proportional representation in their business, or something like that. Now, proportional representation actually technically is the law in the United States. Like, you can be sued if your workforce doesn't match to at least an 82 or whatever it is. I haven't been there for a while, but percent doesn't match to a 0.82 degree the racial percentage breakdown of the state or the population around you. And this is across a whole bunch of different work categories. So if a large company or a government employer says, we won't work with you unless you do this, and there's a law backing them up, all of a sudden everyone starts doing this. And you have a policy that sweeps through every business in the country. And that's what affirmative action is. If you have to have a proportionate number of, say, Asians, whites, blacks, and Hispanics, and those 4 groups perform on a standardized board test in that order, you're going to have major hiring differences between those groups. And I didn't even get a Native American, South Sea Islanders. And it's horrible to rank countrymen in this way, but that's what that leads to. If you just hire people, you don't really have to worry about this. You just give everyone a test, you'll still get a multicolored group coming through the door, and they'll be perfectly able to sell widgets or whatnot. But yeah, Walmart doing the reverse is a big move. Last thing, I think a lot of people saw what happened to Bud Light, then Harley, Jaguar, large companies. What was the other one? Target? Tractor Supply. Yeah, the major players. There's a company that had tucking bathing suits for small children. That was Target. Yeah, I think that the CEOs of these companies are not necessarily low aggression people that are really going to be tolerant of this kind of thing. I can imagine the reactions to some of that. Like, we were selling what? That was made, almost certainly some sales director was just like, yeah, I'm pro-LGBT. And almost equally certainly they don't work there anymore. So, good move. It's a good thing. Are there any other questions? Going once? Okay, looks like we're done. Bravo. Yeah, thank you.